What if the ancient Greeks understood the dark side of human mind more clearly than modern psychology? Long before Freud spoke of repression, long before Jung described the shadow, and long before neuroscience mapped emotional circuits, the Greeks had already named the forces that distort perception, collapse judgment, and lead a person away from their true nature. The Pantheon, a neural architecture of the cosmos. Before we dive deeper into Hybris Ate Nemesis Tisis, we need to understand the mental world that produced them. Because the Greek Pantheon, it is not just a collection of gods, it's a neural network, it's a symbolic architecture mapping how energy, consciousness, and disorder move through the universe and through the human psyche. And the word Pantheon reveals this immediately because Pan means all, everything, the totality, and Theon from Theon, which is the divine, which is a word connected to two ancient roots. One, tithimi, which is to place, to set something in order, and two, theo, which is to run, to move with unstoppable speed. In both cases, the divine is not a person. It is motion, order, flow, the very unfolding of reality. The Greek gods were expressions of cosmic functions, of forces, of patterns and movements of energy. This is why the Greek world begins in chaos and night, passes through the Titanomachy, and only then reaches the order of Zeus. And this is not simply mythology, it is cosmogony. It is a description of how reality organizes itself, how consciousness stabilizes, and how order emerges out of the unformed. And every god in this chain is a component of the universe. It is a frequency, it is a specific mode of awareness. The 12 Olympians complete the highest level of the structure. Even their home, Olympus, reveals its meaning. Olympos is from Ololambis, it means all shiny, it's the peak of consciousness. So from the chaotic depths to the highest vibration, the Pantheon forms a complete spectrum of forces. But below the Olympians, the Greeks placed another layer of beings, the uplifting powers and the entrapping powers. So some elevate the mind towards clarity, harmony, and self-knowledge, and others bind the soul to illusion, confusion, and inner collapse. These entrapping powers were not demons, they were your own unmastered tendencies, your errors of perception, your loss of self-command, and your unintegrated shadow. So the Greeks personified these forces as monsters: Medusa, the Lernaean Hydra, the Chimaera, the Minotaur, the Sphinx. Not to frighten children, but to reveal the inner structures that grow when consciousness loses its center. And this is exactly what Nikola Tesla centuries later said when he says, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. The ancients already knew this. Their entire mythic system is an energetic map from the formation of the cosmos to the formation of the human soul. And the same pattern appears at the psychological level. When inner order collapses, hybris rises. Hybris then blinds the mind, and this blindness is Ate. And Ate provokes the correction of reality, which is Nemesis. And if a person refuses to learn, there comes Tisis, which is the final consequence. And these are not just moral lessons, they are laws of inner physics, the mechanics of the psyche. Now let's take a closer look, because each of these forces matches a precise pattern of psychological breakdown, and each mythic monster corresponds to a very specific distortion of the self. So before we begin, let's see first what myth really is. The 5 levels of myth interpretation according to Proclus. A myth is multi-layered and can be read on many levels, which must be recognized to reveal its full philosophical and theological depth. Proclus uses the hierarchy of reality, divine, intelligible, psychic, and material to correspond to the levels of myth interpretation. 1. Historical and material level. So here the myth is understood as a simple narration of events or a fictional story as an uneducated listener would perceive it, and the characters and actions serve as models for moral behavior in everyday life. 2. Physical, cosmological level. So the gods here and their actions are symbols of the forces and phenomena of nature. Zeus, for example, is the ether, Hera is the atmosphere, and so on. And it describes the order and functions of the cosmos, of the world of the senses, which is our world, cosmos, elements, planets. This level includes the astronomical or astrological interpretations. 3. Psychological, ethical level. The events of the myth are understood here as states and struggles within the human soul. For example, battles between gods and heroes as the internal conflicts between the rational, spirited, and appetitive parts of our soul. So it leads to the ethical improvement and purification, the catharsis of the soul. 4. Metaphysical, intelligible level. The myth here refers to the forms, to the ideas and the essences of our world. So it reveals the structures and hierarchies of the forms, which are the basics of the world of the senses. 5. Theological, transcendent level. So this is the highest and most sacred level. The myth refers to the primordial deities and the One, which is the monad, and the transcendent principle, and it explains the hierarchy of divine beings and how the world was created from the One and how humans can unite with it. The Greeks never divided the world into good and evil. That dualism comes much later. They divided reality into two states: what is in accordance with nature and what has moved away from it. The shadow for them wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a demon hiding in the dark. It was a force inside the human being, a potential that could become creative insight or destructive blindness, and depending on whether the person lived in harmony with their own and nature. And when we say nature, we mean the whole structure of the cosmos. Every collapse of the human soul begins from within, not from curses, not from divine punishment, but from a psychological sequence that's recognized already in archaic Greece. We have a fourfold movement of inner disorder, which is Hybris Ate Nemesis Tisis. Hybris is the swelling of the ego beyond its measure, and Ate is the blindness that follows the loss of measure, and Nemesis is the restoring counterforce that reality applies. And Tisis is the final consequence if you don't align yourself with the harmony of the cosmos. So this is the Greek shadow. It's not a monster outside us, but the moment we turn against our own nature, and that's when the universe answers. 1. Hybris, the first fracture. Hybris comes from ivris, a word rooted in the idea of hyper, how we say hyper in English, going beyond proper limits, and combined with a sense of violence and insult and assault. This is a very dangerous place to be. So in classical Greek, it meant far more than arrogance. Ivris was profanation, outrage, the violation of measure, and it included ekia, which means the act of wounding, harming, degrading, and propylakismos, which means throwing clay, mud at someone, literally, humiliating them to elevate yourself. So hybris is the moment when a person claims more than what actually belongs to them. Grabbing, taking, seizing, not necessarily out of strength, but out of inner balance. This is not confidence, it's distortion, it's a swelling of the self beyond its natural boundary. The Greeks understood that downfall never begins with catastrophe, it begins with a slight expansion, a subtle but dangerous inflation of the ego. The sense that I am above consequences, that measure doesn't apply to me, my judgment is enough. Psychologically, hybris is an impulsive certainty, an inflated ego, a loss of inner proportion, the belief that the world will bend to your will, the refusal to listen to the inner logos. And hybris is the first fracture, the point where a person steps outside harmony and it begins to lose sight of themselves. Every tragedy, every Greek tragedy begins with hybris, and every psychological collapse too. 2. Ati, the blindness that follows. Ati comes from the ancient word aao, which means to blind, to bewilder, to damage the mind. And the noun ati meant exactly that. Confusion of thought, derangement, the clouding of judgment. It was the state in which a person loses the inner thread of clarity and acts under a kind of inward haze. In myth, Ati is a goddess. It's the very personification of ruinous delusion. She was the daughter of Eris, according to Hesiod, or cast out by Zeus, according to Homer. Her siblings are actually telling the story because her siblings are pain, forgetfulness, disease, strife, murder, deceit, falsehood. Nice family. But all of this is not evil. It's the forces that unravel from inside the mind. Ati is not stupidity. Ati is when the mind becomes opaque to itself. You don't realize you've lost clarity. You believe you're still seeing straight, while in truth, you are already drifting. And this is the psychological brilliance here, because Ati is cognitive distortion thousands of years before psychology named it confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, self-deception, inner fog. Hybris breaks the order. Ati blinds the judgment, and it's the moment when the soul, having stepped outside its measure, can no longer recognize its own reflection. 3. Nemesis, the return of balance. Nemesis comes from the verb nemo, which means to distribute, to allot, to restore what belongs where. In its earliest meaning, nemin meant to give each thing its proper portion, to re-establish the right order of the world. In myth, Nemesis is the daughter of Nyx, which is night, sister to forces like deceit, doom, old age, strife. It's all a big family. And these are not embodiments of punishment, but the structures that maintain cosmic and moral balance. And this is the crucial point. Nemesis is not revenge, it is not anger, it is the world correcting distortion. So when inner measure is violated, reality will begin to press back, and sometimes gently, a discomfort, a hesitation, a sense that something is off here, and sometimes sharply, a consequence that forces self-recognition. In the Psyche Nemesis is the first crack of insight. The moment you realize your choices are reshaping your life, that the pattern you have created now is creating you. It is this whisper that you have crossed the line. And Nemesis is the return of balance, the invitation to step back into harmony before the collapse becomes irreversible. Tisis, the final consequence. Tisis comes from the verb tio, which means to honor, to pay what is owed, to give what is due. In the ancient mind, Tisis was not vengeance, it was completion, the final stage in a cycle of moral cause and effect, the moment when what has been set in motion returns to its source. So, if Nemesis is the correction, Tisis is the settling of accounts, the point where the distortion that began with Hybris has matured into its natural consequence. This is why the Greeks never spoke of punishment. They spoke of nomos, which is law, structure, and inevitability. Every act shapes the soul, and every choice carves a path. And when a person walks far enough down that path, they eventually meet what they themselves have created. Tisis is the echo of your actions returning home. So the full weight of one's actions coming back into alignment, not as cruelty, but as truth made visible. So what begins in disorder ends in revelation, and the soul finally sees what it refused to see at the very start. This is Tisis. It's the end of a cycle, and the mirror that cannot be avoided. The Chthonic Archetypes, faces of the shadow. The Greeks didn't end their psychology with a sequence of collapse. They gave the shadow form and concrete symbols, chthonic beings born from the deep strata of the psyche, living metaphors that reveal what the soul becomes when it falls into hybris and wanders through the blindness of Ate. And these are not monsters, these are states of consciousness, the inner shape a person takes when their nature fragments. Medusa, the Hydra, the Minotaur, the Sphinx, each one is a mirror of a different distortion, a different way that human mind can lose itself. 1. Medusa, the paralysis of fear. Medusa comes from the verb medo, which means to govern, to protect. She was once a guardian. But when the mind distorts, protection becomes paralysis. To see Medusa directly is to freeze, to lose movement, to become stone. And this is the freeze of the trauma, the freeze response to trauma. A fear so overwhelming that the psyche stops functioning. In the older Greek tradition, Medusa is a chthonic being. Chthonios means earthly being. It's a symbol of the primal, instinctive depths of the psyche. It's not a punished woman. It's a power of the underworld mind. Later storytellers like Ovid turned Medusa into a beautiful priestess who lies with Poseidon in Athena's temple. And this is a reinterpretation that emphasizes transformation, not guilt. And that transformation is key because Poseidon is the emotional sea within us. That's what Poseidon represents always. The shifting tides of feeling and instinct. And Athena is the clear mind. It's strategy, order, awareness. Medusa is what happens when the inner sea overwhelms the mind's structure. emotion without form, and fear without direction. And Perseus is the conscious self that must face this terror. But how does he defeat her? Not by looking directly, but through reflection, using Athena's polished shield. So through distance, clarity, and through self-observation. So this is psychological truth. When fear is overwhelming us, direct confrontation destroys. What saves us is reflection. Medusa is not a monster. She's the face the psyche cannot face until awareness learns to look without turning to stone. A Medusa used to be pretty. Remember, she was taken by Poseidon, that means reality, the constant waves of situations, emotions, fears, confusions of life itself. So we're talking about a childhood trauma. That's why she was once pretty. In Greek myth, the masculine and the feminine are not about gender. They are archetypal functions that describe how psychic energy moves. So the masculine principle initiates, it penetrates reality, sets direction, sparks change, and fertilizes a psychological state. The feminine principle receives and shapes. It's the field of the psyche where impressions are absorbed, where emotions start taking form, and where inner material is finally born into experience. So the masculine gives the impulse and the feminine gives the form. So this means something, that whatever the feminine receives from the masculine, clarity or chaos, order or distortion, it will amplify it, shape it, and ultimately manifest it. So if the inner masculine is turbulent, the feminine becomes the womb of fear. If the inner masculine is clear, the feminine side becomes the womb of insight. This is why in Greek myth, Poseidon, the emotional sea, and Athena, the structured mind, interacts with figures like Medusa, because every mythic union is the psyche shaping what the inner forces have put into motion. Medusa, the paralysis of fear. The psychological state. Traumatic freeze response and self-confrontation aversion. Medusa, from medo, to govern, represents the primitive protective function of the psyche that has become overwhelming. To see her directly is to be petrified. The mind is halted by sheer, unmediated, primal terror. The solution, Perseus. Defeat is achieved not through direct confrontation, but through reflection, which is Athena's shield. And this is the act of psychological self-observation, creating a safe distance to study overwhelming fear or trauma without being consumed by it. 2. The Lernaean Hydra, multiplying passions. Hydra comes from Hydor, which is water. It's the nature of water. Shapeless, shifting, impossible to grasp. And this is exactly what she represents. The Hydra is the archetype of multiplying passions. Desires, addictions, impulses that grow stronger every time you try to kill them directly. Cut off one head and two more appear. So in the myth, the Hydra is born of Typhoon and Echidna, which are again dark forces of chaos and instinct. She is raised by Hera, which is the psychic field of life itself. In many times, Hera represents the soul itself, and it's the womb that gives form to whatever enters it. So this detail is crucial. The soul nourishes the monster when it does not understand its own depths. So her home is the marshes of Lerna, which is an area in Greece, stagnant waters basically. The symbolic landscape of unexamined emotions. Hercules faces her as part of the hero's path, which is the same path walked by Theseus, which is the ascent of consciousness fighting its lower nature. And how does he win? Not by force, not by cutting, but by burning the roots with fire. So the fire, it's the ancient symbol of awareness, of flight of consciousness coming through instinct. The Hydra is the inner truth that you don't defeat destructive habits by attacking their symptoms. You defeat them by burning the very source. The final head of Hydra, the immortal one, Hercules cuts it and buries it beneath the earth, so it can never rise again. And from Hydra's blood, Hercules poisons his arrows, which is a reminder that even our darkest battles can become weapons of clarity when consciousness transforms them. So the Hydra is not a monster, it is the self, when desire multiplies faster than we can understand it. The Lernaean Hydra, multiplying passions. The psychological state, addiction, compulsion, symptom fighting. The Hydra, which is ether, water, is shapeless, multiplying desire, cutting off a symptom, a head, only causes the underlying pattern of addiction, bad habit, compulsion to sprout new, stronger symptoms. The solution is Hercules. The hero must burn the root with fire. This means applying the concentrated, unclouded light of consciousness to the source of the desire, rather than just treating the visible manifestations. 3. The Chimaera, fragmented will. Chimaera means a creature of mixed nature, a lion, a goat, and a serpent. 3 incompatible impulses forced into one body. She is born of Typhoon and Echidna. She is a chaotic force and deep instinct, and this origin matters again because the Chimaera is not simply a monster, she is the fractured soul. So the lion pulls towards anger and dominance, the goat towards desire and craving, and the serpent towards fear, avoidance, and retreat. So here we have 3 wheels, 3 directions, and no unity. This is the psychology of inner conflict, when the self is torn between impulses that cannot coexist, and the person loses the ability to move as one whole being. So the Chimaera breathes fire because fragmentation always burns. It consumes energy, and scatters intention, and leaves the psyche totally exhausted. And who defeats her? Bellerophon, riding Pegasus, the horse, with the guidance of Athena. And once again, what we have here is the hero, who is the higher consciousness. We have Pegasus, which is the uplifted mind, and Athena, which is clarity. So Bellerophon does not overpower the Chimaera. He rises above her, he flies with Pegasus, taking to the air so the monster cannot drag him into his own divided nature. So this is the teaching. You cannot defeat inner conflict by choosing one impulse over the others. You transcend it. but by rising into a higher vantage point. That's when someone with a unifying consciousness can see the entire divided self at once. So the Chimaera is the soul when its will is split, its direction is scattered, and its energy divided against itself. And the only way to overcome this is elevation. It's a consciousness that refuses to live at this level of the conflict. A mind that has wings. The Chimaera, fragmented will, the psychological state, inner conflict and divided self, a creature of three incompatible impulses, lion, goat, and serpent, represents a soul torn between opposing wills, for example, aggression, dominance, lust, craving, and fear avoidance. This state is exhausting because the energy is spent fighting itself, breathes fire. The solution, Bellerophon and Pegasus. Elevation and unifying awareness. The hero must ascend above the conflict on Pegasus, which is the uplifting mind or imagination, to a higher vantage point. Inner conflict is not solved by choosing one impulse, but by achieving a unified awareness that transcends the internal war. The Sphinx, the question of the self. The Sphinx doesn't kill with claws, she kills with a question. Basically, she is asking, what is the human being? If you cannot answer, you are destroyed not by the monster, but by your own ignorance. In the myth, the Sphinx is born from the same Chthonic family as the Hydra and the Chimaera, and it's a creature shaped from the depths of the unconscious. She stands at a crossroads, testing every traveler with a riddle about the nature of man. And those who cannot answer are crushed by her grip, which is a symbol of what happens when the soul reaches a turning point without self-knowledge. And then we have Oedipus. And Oedipus is the archetype of the human being who seeks truth without any compromise, even when the truth leads to devastation. And Oedipus answers the Sphinx. Not because he's clever, but because he embodies the core of the riddle itself. The human being is a creature that changes, that grows, that falls, that rises, that walks differently at every stage of life. And by solving the riddle, Oedipus shows that he understands the evolving nature of the self. And that is why the Sphinx collapses, not because she is defeated by force, but because her question has been answered. Her role was complete. So the lesson here is that if you do not know who you are, your shadow will devour you. But if you can answer the question of the self, if you can see your own truth, your own nature, no chthonic power can control you. So the Sphinx is the threshold between unconscious life and true awareness. Those who cannot answer remain trapped, and those who can continue the path. The Sphinx, the question of the self. The psychological state. Ignorance of self-nature. The Sphinx, who kills with a riddle, represents the ultimate test of self-knowledge. To be destroyed is to lack awareness of one's own changing, evolving nature. What is the human being? The solution, Oedipus, self-recognition. The moment Oedipus answers the question, the shadow's power collapses. The underlying lesson is that power is surrendered to the unconscious only when the conscious self cannot name or understand its own essence. The Minotaur lost instinct into the labyrinth. The Minotaur is not a monster, he is raw instinct without guidance, the animal force inside the human being when it has no center, no direction, and no measure. And where does this creature live? In the labyrinth. It's the perfect symbol of the unconscious with its twisted corridors, its dead ends, its hidden chambers, and it is a place where instinct roams without reason. So the Minotaur is the self when desire, fear, and aggression move without the guidance of the higher mind. Adrianis' thread is the Logos. It's the ordering principle that allows you to move through confusion without being swallowed by it. So Theseus does not defeat the Minotaur because he's stronger. He defeats him because he carries the thread, because he refuses to enter the unconscious without a point of return. So the Minotaur is the instinctual self trapped in its own maze. And Theseus is the emerging consciousness that descends into the dark with clarity, with structure, and with a guiding line. So the lesson here is that when instinct becomes a labyrinth, you don't fight it harder. You find the thread and you follow quietly and gently the Logos. And the monster loses its power. The Minotaur lost instinct in the labyrinth, the psychological state. Unreasoned, trapped instinct. The Minotaur is pure, raw, animalistic force, desire or aggression, confined in the labyrinth, the confusing, non-linear depths of the unconscious. It is powerful instinct that has lost its measure and direction. The solution, Theseus, the Logos, the thread of orientation, Mythos. You do not defeat raw instinct with more brute force. You defeat it by using a conscious, ordering principle to navigate the unconscious depths. The thread is a guiding structure that allows the descent into the shadow while guaranteeing a return to consciousness. Why the Greeks mapped the shadow so precisely? The Greeks mapped the shadow so precisely because they never imagined the psyche as a battlefield between good and evil. They saw it as a field of forces, as energies that arise, collide, distort, and either create harmony or dissolve it. So collapse was not moral failure, it was a sequence, it was a loss of measure, and it was inner physics. And shadow was not a demon, it was energy without orientation. And freedom had nothing to do with obedience, it had to do with inner order. So the Greek myths are psychological instructions that are disguised as stories. They are maps of the mind written in symbolic form, teaching us how consciousness moves, how it fractures, and how it can return to itself. The path out. Recognition, order, consciousness. So the Greeks were never afraid of darkness. They studied it, they named it, they understood its laws, and they knew that Hybris can be recognized, that Ate can be dissolved, that Nemesis can be heard, and that Tisis can be transformed. And every monster inside the soul is simply a power waiting for orientation. We don't need exorcism here, we don't need suppression, we need alignment. When fear becomes Medusa, you meet it with reflection. When desire multiplies like Hydra, you burn the root, not the heads. And when the will is scattered like the Chimaera, you rise above it with clarity. When instinct traps you like the Minotaur, you follow the thread of Logos. So the path is the same today as it was in antiquity. Recognition, measure, and conscious action. This is the proper Greek way. It's the way beyond illusion and back into reality. The ancient Greek mapping of these forces reveals a psychology focused on inner physics, the laws of energy, of measure, of order within the soul. And this system predates modern concepts of the shadow and cognitive distortion, presenting them not as moral failings but as predictable, inevitable sequences resulting from the loss of inner proportion. The Greeks knew that freedom does not begin with conquering the world, but with governing the self. A person who knows the shadow cannot be manipulated, cannot be controlled, and cannot be deceived, because nothing is darker than the part of yourself that you refuse to see. And nothing is brighter than the part of yourself that you choose to illuminate. Thank you very much. Bye.